This is episode 2 of Beckett's group therapy, a place to hang our hats, a director's approach to waiting for Godot. And this is Hunter.
This is Scott.
And I'm Nick.
I'm Alice.
And so for this episode of the podcast, we're going to be talking specifically about Waiting for Godot, but potentially some of Beckett's other plays, and just kind of acting like if we were to direct the play, kind of what decisions would we make, how would we deal with the actors, set design, and things like that. So does anyone want to start off kind of their idea of their production?
Honestly, I wouldn't mind starting off because I've kind of been holding on to an idea since we talked about the concept of this podcast. And essentially my idea in writing this piece that I've been writing and working from Paul Foster's text on Beckett and Zen Buddhism, I've really focused on the themes of nothingness in Waiting for Godot. And honestly, on almost every single page, I can find nothing on there, both literally and not so literally. And so for me, my mind instantly goes to this work of nothingness, or the work of without sound, which is like black and white, no sound applied to it. So when I think of like a director's or theatrical kind of use of it, I think of black and white, soundless cinema. So in my mind's eye, I see like these black and white images of, whether it be Waiting for Godot or like Endgame, and panning in on like our characters of Vladimir and Estragon, and essentially having words pop up after they've said something very old-timey, and then the reliance that many of these directors had on like countenance. They had a lot of focus on facial expression because where you don't have that tonality and like the voice directly to carry someone's emotion, the biggest thing we rely on is their face. It's very like biologically based, I guess we could say, but a lot of the focus they would bring is like panned in shots on the face. And for me, I think that's kind of where I would mostly focus, is on the importance of countenance and what that means for Vladimir and Estragon as they're waiting for Godot. So
yeah, I definitely think a lot about how like the language in the text doesn't really reveal a lot of meaning on its own at times, and like the kind of emphasis that would put on the actors, like because the actors kind of breathe life into the meaning of the words through their performance. And I think that's something that I would like, if I was directing this play, I would focus on heavily, like in discussion with actors. And I guess another thing that we should maybe go around and say is like what everyone's experience in theater is, maybe, since we're talking about like directing it, or if we have any at all. Because I know, Alice, you like have reviewed theater, right?
Yes, yeah.
So what was your experience with theater, maybe?
My experience with theatre is mainly back home in England. I review a lot of student theatre for the student magazines and newspapers, and I also work as a stage manager at my university. So that is just essentially building the set, finding props, making sure everything goes on at the correct time. However, it's usually the director who tells me exactly what props they want, what set they want. So I'm not going to argue that I have much experience in actually coming up with a creative vision, but in the process of this podcast, I will do my best to have a go at that.
Yeah, and I mean that alone holds a lot.
Yeah, I think
insight.
that's a lot. Yeah, like definitely being a stage manager gives you really interesting perspectives, because I've never been a stage manager, but like it's a tall task. So like, Hunter, do you have any background?
Well, in elementary school, I was in a Manifest Destiny, somewhat Go West production, typical to where I grew up. But yeah, I mean, I have no real direct experience in theater, but
you watch a lot of theater.
I do, and that's where most of it comes from for me. Most of my experience is like my passion and my interest in theater, and not only in like analyses of that, but also in just the entertainment value of it as a whole. Yeah.
I don't know what kind of
So yeah, you guys are probably going to want to yield to my opinions when it comes to this. In 4th grade, I was tree number 4 in my Missoula Children's Theater play. I got a lot of compliments for my striking performance and portrayal. I sat down really well when we sang. That's about it, though. I didn't have a line because I forgot it. So that was pretty much all I had, but
I mean, the tree in Waiting for Godot doesn't have a line either. So.
Yeah, I was actually hoping Mr. Lubner would ask me to come play the tree for class one day, but I guess he didn't respond to my email. But no, I actually have a very limited perspective on directing and so forth with that.
Interesting. So I actually have directed a play before, so not to flex on everybody, but...
Well, you're not.
Yeah. But, I mean, it was in high school, but I did direct a play that was actually about the Holocaust. So I do have a little bit of perspective there, but, like, I don't think my perspective is, like, over anybody else's. I don't think you necessarily have to direct to, like, have a unique perspective on Waiting for Godot. And then I have, like, acted a little bit in, like, Julius Caesar and things like that, and been tech. So I have but it's been a while since I've been involved in theater, because that was in high school, which was a while ago. But yeah, so I think we all have like enough perspective, and we've seen enough shows, and we've been involved in different ways that will give like a unique idea to the different ways we could perform Waiting for Godot.
Well, and could you elaborate a little more on this production that you directed, like pertaining to the Holocaust? Because I think that's very, topical.
Yeah, definitely for
Beckett. Yeah, I mean Beckett's time as an author, as well as kind of the thematics of Waiting for Godot as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. So the play that I directed was called "And a Child Shall Lead," and I can't remember the name of the guy who wrote the play. But the set was very minimal in a similar way that kind of Waiting for Godot is, or at least in how I staged the set. But the play took place at Theray concentration camp, which was the Red Cross visited there during World War II. Yeah, so I think Michael Slade was the writer of it. But Theray was kind of where like all the artists and athletes who were in concentration camps were sent, and so like they didn't. Like it was kind of if you could ever say, the best of the concentration camps, because they wanted it to look a little bit better. So even though there were terrible things going on at the concentration camp, obviously it's still a concentration camp, but they invited the Red Cross there, and they made things look as good as they could have to kind of hide what was going on. And so, but the perspective of that play actually takes place. It's from the point of kids, and it's about kids writing down what's going on there, so they like almost make like a newspaper, and it's based off of a true story. But it's just definitely interesting of how that set was designed, and it definitely, I guess I can also go into how I would stage Waiting for Godot, because there's definitely a lot of similarities just because of like my experience. So I directed that other play in a black box theater, and I'm a very big fan of a very minimal set to let the actors kind of go crazy.
Could you possibly expand on a black box theater for any of our listeners who might not
understand so black box, I mean, I haven't been in one in a while, but it's basically like surrounding like the whole theater. It's a dark room. There's 4 bombs that actually I can illustrate maybe what it might look like on screen, so we can see. So hopefully this is up, and if we look at it, there'd be 4 bombs or entrances that the actors will come through, and that's kind of the corners, and then maybe one of these might be the entrance where the people will come in, and then right here would be, say, the booth where tech is at, where the stage manager would be up hitting sound cues and light cues. And then there's multiple ways that you can kind of stage it. There's so how I staged it was alleyway, so you have this whole kind of 360 view of the stage, and then alleyway, the audience goes here. This is why I'm not an art major. This is some tough writing. So here's the audience, and then the play takes place all throughout here. I'll delete that. So that's just one way, and that's where I personally would stage Waiting for Godot. But you can also stage it where you can have 3/4 where the audience, it's almost similar to an auditorium perspective where the audience is, at these 3 spots and then the performer's here. And then you can also do round robin where the audience is on all 4 spots of the stage. And then you perform in the middle. I know I've seen a production, a couple of productions like that, where really the actors are really like next to the audience versus like if you saw it in an auditorium, they're a little bit removed from the play. So I think it would be a really interesting way and an interesting challenge for the actors for Waiting for Godot.
So could you expand on why you think that this kind of setup would be good for Waiting for Godot in particular? What would that allow you to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me delete some of these things over here. So how I would have staged it is basically just a beautiful drawing of a tree and like the rock and some pretty distant space between the two. But having the audience on each side and having the actors in the middle kind of roaming around just gives a really intimate relationship between the actors and the audience. And so I think for a play that is so focused on performance, because the language doesn't really tell the whole story explicitly, that having so much space on stage, but having the actors on both sides of you, the audience on both sides of you instead of being separated for them, just would maybe bring kind of the audience more into the story and help the actors' performances. And I just like all of the productions that I've seen of Waiting for Godot, all the images are in an auditorium style, but I think like a black box style, I'm sure it's performed a lot by high schoolers because a lot of high schools have access to black box theaters. But I just think that would give a really interesting perspective to the play.
Yeah, what about like the kind of monologues in the play? So you've got Lucky's massive tirade, and I think Pozzo has a few. How would you like direct your actors to deliver those? Like, would they have to move between the different audiences? Or?
Yeah, so they definitely would, and that is a sacrifice of having specifically the alleyway type, because if you're looking obviously at one audience side, the other gets your back. And so I know I'm kind of obsessed with blocking in plays and like having very specific blocking that can help reveal things. So like when a character moves, it's a different beat in the monologue. And so I think you could structure the monologue in a really cool way, because a lot of Beckett's writing is like very lyrical in a sense, as a rhythm to it. And I think performing a monologue where you're kind of bouncing between the two audiences in between the rock and the tree could be a really unique way to perform specifically Lucky's big monologue. But I just think it lends itself, it's obviously the experience that I have working in a black box, but I just, every time I think of Waiting for Godot, that's what I think of an auditorium and not a black box.
And I mean, not to like impede your artistic view here, because I mean the way you kind of articulate bouncing between stages, bouncing between bodies of the audience, I think also looking at it coming from, I mean, the rock to the tree also could be a way of like a runway.
True.
So like as far as we think of Lucky's monologue, I mean, Lucky doesn't seem to be moving as much as being static, but if we were to see it as like a way of making gestures at both sides of the audience,
absolutely.
Which is just the same as much as your idea.
The blocking doesn't necessarily need to be actual physical movement, but just like from like walking, but just like looking back and forth can actually really show a lot of meaning just from like where an actor looks. And when you're that close on stage, like with the actors, and like a look from one side of the stage to another can like reveal so much meaning. And that would also be, I think, a really unique challenge for the actors to play with, is like, what do you do instead of right where the audience is in the same place, if they're in two different locations and they're a lot closer to you, it just kind of changes how you have to look at the performance.
Just from your experience, is there a tendency of the actors to favor one side of the auditorium, or?
Maybe a little bit, because I did act in a play that was like this, so that's another reason why I'm very biased towards this type of staging. I think there can be, but I think typically, like, when you're in the moment, you're so focused on being the character that it's kind of routine that you set in audition and not in auditions and rehearsals. Like when you work with an actor a lot in rehearsals, you can kind of pinpoint down the little things like that of like staging, and then kind of when they're on stage, hopefully that they're just kind of enveloped in the performance where they're not really leaning towards one side or another. But I guess as a director, if they were, that would be something that you'd have to, because you don't want one audience to get screwed where you just see the back of someone the whole time.
Yeah.
And you want to give the audience a good perspective. And when you go to see a play like this as an audience member, you know the kind of differences that it's going to be, because you get to see a different view of the stage than you would normally if you were in like an auditorium.
Is there any impact on the audience in being able to, I suppose, see the other part of the audience? Is that a factor that...
There definitely could be. I haven't really thought about that from that perspective, but I think there definitely could be implications of just like knowing that the audience is on the other side. Could be definitely an interesting thing to think about if I were to stage this play.
Sure.
Or to even stage any play like this. Yeah, so I don't know if, do you have an interesting way that you would potentially stage?
Perhaps not as well thought out and structured as the one that you've just drawn. I don't have anything to draw on your cool little tablet. But having read the play in both English and French, one thing I've noticed is that the already very minimal stage directions in English are even more sparse in French. And I find it quite interesting because I read in an article somewhere that I'm gonna quote here, the Beckett estate has refused permission to productions it deems to be too remote from the author's vision. And that is by Dixon, and you can find that article in our work cited. But it's just crazy to me, because I think that the stage directions and the set that Beckett actually paints out for us is so minimal. How does one be too remote from that vision if it's already so sparse? So I think what would be interesting, like we've already noted in class that the production has, lent itself very well to different cultural contexts, but like, is there a way to eliminate all context and set it in a world where that has been so obliterated, so deconstructed that we cannot tell, that we literally have no idea what time period this is set in, what cultural location this is in. So we've obviously got the figure of the tree, which in the New Orleans production was actually just two pipes kind of stuck together with I think a singular leaf on one of the pipes. So perhaps the tree could be hollowed out, like eaten away at by nature, or almost as if like there's been some kind of explosion, or we've just got some remnants of a tree, some remnants of a stone. In terms of props, we could have props from different time periods. So this weird kind of disconnect between maybe Lucky wearing a hat that lends itself to one time period and a coat that lends itself to another, just constantly confusing the audience and making them, I don't know, just really unsure of the cultural and geographical location. I think that would kind of be an interesting way to do it, just some kind of undecipherable future. So that is kind of how I've imagined it. I haven't thought about staging or anything, but I just think instead of adapting it to one particular location, let's adapt it to no location.
Yeah, I find that entirely so interesting, because I mean, thinking of Beckett as playwright, thinking of Beckett in writing Waiting for Godot, in the context that we've read it, I find myself already in a state of mind where it's my own background and my own coming to it with the knowledge I have and piecing it and creating it in my own way. So I think it would be wonderful if you could articulate it in a way so at some point you have this nearly Baroque era coat that you come out in, and then the next moment you have a 2000s bucket hat on. I mean,
but kind of decayed and stained and torn.
Yeah.
That would be
like each prop should have a history that you can only guess at.
Yeah, that's what I love about the ambiguity. One of the elements of ambiguity I love about reading a play, especially as we see Beckett writing it, is there's nothing so articulate or concise as to paint a particular picture for us. Like it's open to our own interpretation, which I think would be great if you could convey that for like a theater, like an audience.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons why Waiting for Godot seems like weirdly really modern, and same with Endgame, is that the fact that there's no setting means that you can either make it be any setting almost, or you can actually leave it completely ambiguous as to what it is. So that means for like as far as I'm alive, like I could see performances of Waiting for Godot happening in completely different ways, and that's one of the things that makes it so unique, is that you can get a production like the New Orleans production that you just talked about, kind of focusing on Hurricane Katrina and setting it there, but then you could also have a production where you just have no idea where it's set and you kind of get to come up with that. So I think it's a really cool thing for a director to be able to go, you know, maybe as far into maybe what Beckett's original vision was, to really have no idea where it was, or to go the completely opposite way and set it in a highly specific way to change maybe some of the context and in return some of the meaning of the original play. It's interesting.
The one thing that's always interested me is I've kind of imagined it in this kind of like this unspecific place, and yet every character, doesn't it mention that every character has the same type of hat somewhere in the play?
So,
and I just think if we've lost all of nature, if it's so obliterated and deconstructed, we have one tree, and maybe not even a whole tree, maybe a remnant of a tree, and one mound or rock, depending on what production you're looking at. Why do they all have matching hats, essentially? So that is just one small thing that struck me. So I feel like the hats should be changed up. Different eras, tattered, torn, obliterated, just like the landscape. That's just a small thing that's occurred to me.
To kind of give it that more universal type context. One thing that really struck out to me when Hunter was talking about his cinematic approach, where there wouldn't be sound but there would be subtitles and stuff provided like that, I was almost thinking that it would be kind of cool to see it without even subtitles at that point, because what even happened? You have people waiting, you have people being distracted, you have people contemplating to hang themselves, and then Pozo and Lucky come, of course, and all that. Do they actually have to say anything for us to understand what's going on, I guess, in the play itself? It's my question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because like a lot of the humor of the play isn't necessarily from the dialogue, but from how the actors portray it. So if the actors know like the beats of the dialogue, like could you understand, or like what kind of meaning would you get from the play if they literally went through anything but you didn't hear any of the words?
Because seeing as I've looked at the translation a lot, I'm kind of biased, and one thing that struck me a lot is Beckett took a long time translating it to English. It's not as if the words convey no meaning, because he actually asked his publisher to push back the date of the release of the English version because he wasn't happy with his translation. And in fact, I've read that the part of the play where he made the most changes, that he was most meticulous about translating it, was actually Lucky's tirade, where when I read through it initially, I thought, this is completely meaningless. This is just showing us that this character is almost insane, and yet that is the part of the play where he was so specific about how it was translated. So I'd like to think that the language does convey a lot of meaning. And the other thing is that because different words are chosen, obviously in the English and the French, there are different semantic links and implications for the audience. And so I'm biased. I think that the words chosen does have a lot of meaning.
I think I agree with that, definitely. Like, it doesn't seem like they mean anything, but in the fact that they feel like they don't, they like almost in return mean so much and like mean a lot of things. And I think it would almost be like, it would be really weird to see a play like that where you just don't see the dialogue or you don't hear the dialogue, but it might be an interesting like exercise almost to really highlight how much Beckett actually is saying through his language, because like it'd be such an interesting experience to see like that. And then if you saw Waiting for Godot with the language and then saw it without, like, I'm sure you would see a valley of difference. Because I definitely think if he thought he could have conveyed the same things without language, he just wouldn't have.
Well, and I mean, we come from that foundation of knowledge, knowing that Beckett has done that. I mean, not with the application of words already there and taking those words necessarily away from it, but thinking of an act without words. I mean, here we have a play where there literally are no words conveyed except given to those who run the stage and, run the stage direction and everything. So I think the point you bring up is really interesting, Scott, because I think it's less an act of how can we do this without words, in my mind's eye, and more so, what do we lose without words? Because, I mean, we can go from articulating, going back to the countenance and the importance of facial expression, we can go from conveying emotion through that all the way to someone, Estragon or Vladimir lifting their leg and representing a fart. I mean, but it's like, it's kind of stands what's in between that we might lose. Or how could we convey it? Like with Lucky, how would we express Lucky's monologue?
You would definitely lose a lot, but it would just kind of be an interesting exercise to see the difference. I mean, it would be interesting for like almost any play, but specifically Beckett's, because he's so known for trying to take as much out of the play as he possibly can out of his stories. So it would be interesting to see that, like, how important the dialogue really is to play. But it also, you have to take into account, like, would you ever actually want to do that? Because it's like, do you really disrespect the words that Beckett put down? Even though it seems like something that, I mean, like, his work moves towards in his later years to try to remove dialogue, but then it's still like, okay, he still wrote this thing, I don't want to. And that's also the same thing with like putting it in completely new context. Like, does that disrespect the author and their wishes by setting it in a crazy situation? Or should you try to stay as close to their original intent, or that what you perceive their original intent to be?
Does Beckett even know what his original intent was?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, that is an incredible point.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think that's the case, because I think one of the great things about theater is that because new people get to perform it with different actors and different productions, that you get to see these new perspectives. But I think it's just kind of an interesting thing to keep in the back of your mind of, like, do you ever want to, how far can you go in altering a play when you're talking about directing it?
There is also one moment in the French, and in the English version, it's a moment where Estragon and Vladimir just decide to insult each other. And then there's a list of different insults that they just exchange. And yet in the French version, that page is blank. And there's just a stage direction that says, exchange of insults. So what could be changed by allowing an actor a little bit more freedom in deciding the lines? Would that work? Would that go away from Beckett's intent? Just another question.
Yeah, I guess like if it was staged in a French production that read a script like that, like you could go on, you can make it very quick, the insults, or you could go on and make the insults just unbelievably elaborate, and or you could just say, like, if depending on the actors that you had to go out and improv that specific scene every single night would be really interesting.
That would be fun.
And it would also be interesting because the language is so specific. It's like when you read it, it feels like you're reading Beckett, but if you're going to let someone improv a random part of insults in the play, like, are they going to go to using modern language? Are they going to try to replicate Beckett's work? Like, it would be just a really interesting thing to see that play staged like that, and to have like maybe an improv section of insults.
Yeah, and I just wonder why he didn't do the same in the English version.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question.
He ends with critic too as the last insult, if I remember right. And I thought that was kind of directed at something, but with it being excluded from the French translation, maybe.
Or maybe he just grew a hatred of critics in 2 years.
Yeah, that's very true.
Or perhaps it was a response to the critical response to the premiere in French. I don't know, just an idea.
Yeah, and then he could just be articulating that because, you know, leaving that kind of open-ended, he needs to like direct it.
Yeah, because
with autonomy.
It seems very like non-Beckett like to just say like, oh, you could potentially just improv this whole section of insults.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that like maybe he wrote it that way. I mean, this is all just speculation, but like maybe he wrote it that way in the French originally, and then he didn't like how they were performing it, so he was like, no, I'm gonna make this more specific of the actual insults that I want to be performed.
Yeah. But then I wonder why he wouldn't go back and change that in the French.
Or perhaps it's my edition, I don't know.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair. Well, I mean, so carrying from theatrical productions back into when I originally hopped in with my idea of like a cinematic production. I mean, so as much as I enjoy theater, we've talked about it, other than some elementary experience with it. I don't have a heavy background in theater, and that doesn't prevent me from like mulling it over and kind of coming to my own terms and thoughts about it. But when I think of Waiting for Godot, I think, my mind carries to what cinema necessarily can do for us. Maybe that theater cannot do do as well.
That's very true.
Especially as far as silent cinema. I mean, we look at the era of silent movies, which came, you know, mostly, if not entirely, before Beckett had written this. Looking at that realm, we think of the shots articulated, and we think of essentially the what is the term? The narrative framing and the cinematic framing of shots. You know, it's one thing for an audience member to be seated in a position where they can only see so much, and to have an entire screen dedicated to what they want spotlighted. So for me, I think that's probably why I fall in cinema so easily, and I've probably had more experience, you know, with cinema since a child than I've ever had with theater.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't even think about if you were to make a movie of this, but it's really interesting because of the differences, because this Waiting for Godot is such a essential like absurdist theater, and the theater of absurdity play, and like when you move it to cinema, I think you definitely have to think about, because cinema is far more, feels like it depicts reality just in the way that it's shot, and depicts realism, even though that isn't all that it can do, and it can obviously depict other things. But like you get that intimacy that you don't get on a stage play through cinema. And I think that's be a really interesting way to stage it, because you can really focus on completely different things, and you can really use the close-up like you said, but I also think you could use like the long take in a really cool way, and just like holding on someone for just an absurd amount of time would be like, because especially in the context of cinema, like every cut in a movie is very quick. It's like a second per cut almost, and so if you were to hold and take like an almost like Stanley Kubrick approach and how he did his films, of like holding on the same thing of no one talking for like, even if it was like for 15 seconds, like the kind of thing that would do to audiences who are just so used to constant cutting, would be really interesting, and it might really highlight kind of the point that he's making of waiting, because like as cinema viewers, like we never wait for anything in cinema, because everything cuts so fast, and studios are so nervous about the audience getting bored, that to see a production of a play that just holds on someone sitting there for a little bit, or just like moves at a crawl and nothing happens, it's like the exact opposite of anything Hollywood would ever want to make. And it would be so cool to see.
Which, and I mean, you know, I was thinking earlier, like, who would I have in these places, or who would I, or even Beckett, look to if he were to make this a silent film? And I think of like Charlie Chaplin. I think of Buster Keaton, and we talk about that kind of production. And I think it was in, I may be wrong, I think it was in 1969. Samuel Beckett actually went out with Buster Keaton and created a film titled Film, as you would expect from Samuel Beckett. And I do think of that, and kind of the different approach that we're so used to in blockbuster Hollywood cinema, with like the quick movements and the constant changing of shots every 3 to 5 seconds, nothing long enough for you to be just focused on. And then yet to still have this same setting where it's like a static backdrop, but to have a focus on like the expressions of these people, and essentially to really articulate and to dial in the very specific things that they do in this backdrop, and what that would end up being produced as a silent film. Like in silent cinema, what would that do for us? And I just find that so interesting, because I think it could do so many things well. Not to distract from what theaters and like this written as a play would do, but new way.
You've kind of got me thinking now of like, what if this was to be adapted, say today, to a film, like who would I want to direct it? And like if someone directed it, like I'm just trying to imagine like a Wes Anderson version of Waiting for Godot, or like a Quentin Tarantino adaptation, like how crazy that would be. So yeah, I just think it's interesting of like it would be just really cool to see like a director that has his stamp and has a very specific style direct something like any of Beckett's works and adapt it into like a short film or like an hour-long movie would be really interesting.
Yeah, I also think of the Coen brothers, or even
that's a great
on the Coen brothers. For those who don't know, would be directing things from No Country for Old Men all the way to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, as well as I think of another set of brothers who direct would be the Safdie brothers, who are most revered for their new films Good Time, as well as Uncut Gems. I mean, I think the people who would approach it and really kind of see what they would do with it. So Nick, I know that you and I recently talked about In Bruges.
Yeah.
And essentially, I don't know who
Martin McDonagh is the director.
Yeah, and their interpretation, or at least the way in which they've taken large chunks from Waiting for Godot and applied that to that. And I just think I think it can be wonderfully done and brought into cinema.
Yeah, I guess like basically In Bruges is like a very modern interpretation of Waiting for Godot. Like if we already have it, it's like In Bruges. But if you'll indulge me for a second, you talking about Uncut Gems made me think of how this play is a tragicomedy, and so it's like the idea, and something that if we were staging it, whether if it was as a film or on theater and working with actors, the idea of many scenes like where the audience doesn't know what emotion to convey, and it just reminds me of Uncut Gems, because there's a scene at the end of the movie where like I was like almost getting teary-eyed, but the rest of the audience was laughing. And so it's like, I think there's a lot of moments throughout Waiting for Godot of like, you don't know whether to laugh or to cry. And so I'm just curious how you guys might approach that. And like, do you think that's something you would talk to with your actors, or if you were directing it, that you would be thinking about like, okay, do I want the audience to laugh or cry here and I need to make it that way? Or do I want it to function in the way that it doesn't matter?
I like the idea of having kind of an ambiguity about, or an uncertainty about the way in which an audience will react. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do if possible.
Yeah.
Being an avid crier that I am, I prefer.
It's okay, this is why this is Beckett's group therapy.
We're all criers here.
Well, I mean, thinking of like the criterial pre-focusing of zooming in shots on focusing on a character's or an actor's face as far as cinema goes, that really usually at least conveys what the audience themselves should be feeling, or at least like if they feel bad, our protagonist, we sympathize for them, or if it's a villain, then we're like laughing as they're in tears, So yeah, I think it would be an interesting approach to see what we could do with that as far as actors as well as actors on a stage. Yeah.
I'm curious if you guys have any other like examples of maybe like theater shows that you've seen or movies that have kind of because like the tragic comedy is such a unique genre, I think. Like, is there anything like modern that you guys think kind of represents that at all? I would just be curious for anyone who's like read Waiting for Godot that there might be like similar comparisons in popular culture that explore like the same genre.
I gotta say, the vast majority of theatre that I watch is musical theatre, which is like as far from Beckett as you can literally get. So I'm gonna pass on that question, although it's an interesting thing to pose.
I don't know if it really pertains to the tragic comedy genre, but a movie that really played with my emotions to where I don't know if I'm feeling what the audience was feeling was Joker that recently came out. Whereas, am I supposed to sympathize or am I supposed to realize that this guy is a murderer at the same time, and kind of that context where it's just that an ambiguity there where it messes with your emotions a little bit and don't know how to portray it, as well as like with Godot, you're kind of to be or not to be. I just like that feeling of it's my interpretation at that point rather than being told what I should feel.
Yeah, that's a really good comparison. I just think of like the ways in which Beckett, because even though his work seems so abstract, that they still tackle very similar things to a lot of the popular culture. And that's kind of what I wrote my paper on, and mine was in context of Endgame, but I compared it to Succession, an HBO show, and how Succession uses language in a very similar way that Beckett does, except it's like a political show and they use like swear words to cover up meaning in the same way that Beckett kind of like just deconstructs meaning. Like Succession deconstructs it to swear words. And so I just think it's interesting how, even though I'd never heard of Beckett before this class, how in reading these texts that are so abstract, they are so like grounded in the same thing in all of the stories that are still coming out today, I feel like.
And I mean, I personally don't mean to make an easy escape or even beat a dead horse or a living Lucky. But I think In Bruges is so fresh for me that I can't possibly see anything past it, because in being entirely different as far as its narrative from Waiting for Godot, it really goes so far as to kind of wonder or make us wonder what we should be laughing about and what we should truly, feel in desperation or even crying about, whether it be from some awful humor that you're wondering, well, am I a god-awful human being for laughing at this, all the way to wondering if in someone wanting to kill themselves, if the essence of that is tragedy or if it's comedy. And yeah, I mean, like I said, it's so fresh to me, having seen it so recently in wake of reading this play. But that's kind of where my mind is going to right now.
And that kind of goes back to his quote, there's nothing funnier than unhappiness.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, that really encapsulates In Bruges as well, like that quote that there's nothing funnier than unhappiness. It's like the main character's very unhappy, and it's still a very funny movie.
Yeah.
Sweet. Well, does anyone have any other thoughts on like directing Godot, or just kind of any thoughts about Beckett's plays in general?
Yeah, I mean, as I said before, just seeing it in a cinematic view is kind of just where my mind has gone to. Just carried to because of, in my lifetime at least, what cinema has done so well, and what I often just tie to cinema versus like what is done in the theater. Yeah.
Sweet. Well, I guess that's it for the second episode of the podcast. And check us out on the next episode. Well, I think we're going back to Beckett's other novels for the next episode. So see you there.
Tree number 4 out.